Welcome and thank you for joining today. We are excited to have you here as part of our Pathlock Innovation Series today. We have a series of events coming up today, and I am shortly going to put the link into the chat with other sessions coming up today. If you would like to schedule or look at our schedule and register yourself, you can go ahead and look at that link that I just put in the chat and register for any of the upcoming sessions coming up. Our session right now is how to prevent material fraud in an ERP cloud environment. And we have two great presenters coming up, Jeff Hare and Donna Curtis from ERP Risk Advisors, and they will introduce themselves in just a moment. My name is Stephanie Anderson. I'm the Global Webinar Manager here at Pathlock. And with that, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. To prevent background noise, everyone is on mute. And if you have any questions, please add them into the question box that you'll see on your control panel. And we will answer those at the end of the event. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Jeff and Donna to introduce themselves.
Awesome. Good morning. Well, I am going to let Donna introduce herself first, ladies first. So Donna, you want to give a brief introduction?
Good morning. My name is Donna Curtis. I'm with ERP Risk Advisors and have been for about 5 years. I've worked with Oracle Cloud for about 8 years now, maybe 9. Anyway, prior to that, I was with Oracle EBS. I've worked in the Oracle industry for about 25 years now. Oh gosh, I'm dating myself, aren't I? Anyway, my area of expertise is security design, and I don't know, I'm an avid cruiser. So that's a little bit about me.
Excellent. Thanks, Donna. Donna is also our ERP Cloud Practice Manager. So welcome, Donna, and I will be picking on you at times to fill in some details that I missed or want you to add some color to. So thanks for joining. And so I'm Jeff Hare. I'm the founder and CEO of ERP Risk Advisors. I, like Donna, have been in the Oracle space for 25 plus years. I think Donna has me by a year. I think she started 96. I started in 97. I was a divisional controller for a publicly traded company, and we implemented Oracle E-Business Suite version 11.02 and have been supporting and auditing Oracle EBS, other applications, and then in the last about 5 years, supporting ERP Cloud implementations and audits. So I am super excited for the topic today. It's when we were invited to present, I thought, what's the one topic that organizations really need to understand when they're implementing ERP Cloud, and one that is relevant not just to publicly traded companies that are subject to Sarbanes-Oxley and have the strict compliance requirements, but one that would be relevant for any organization, public, private, government, and so on. So this is kind of one of my favorite topics. So I'm going to dive in. The topic is how to prevent material fraud in an ERP Cloud environment. We're going to work on not just material fraud, but all fraud. So hopefully that the name doesn't deceive you too much, but we're going to talk about fraud regardless of the size. So agenda, we're going to look at what does effective design and controls look like, and I'm really going to be focusing a lot on vendor master maintenance today. There's a lot of different ways fraud can be committed, but I'm going to hone in really on this one as a topic. I could spend an hour on this, and then another couple hours on things like in the overall procure-to-pay process, like processing payments and one-time payments, invoices, purchase orders, requisitions, and all those aspects. But the easiest way for somebody to commit fraud is just having the ability to maintain vendor master maintenance. So we're going to talk about that. What are the different controls, and then a little bit about enabling audit policies, which form the foundation for having the data you need to understand inserts, updates, and deletes when people are making changes to vendor master data. And then talk overall about what audit policies should be enabled related to IT general controls, how to secure the vendor master, and then effective design of IT general controls, some topics that round out how do we make sure that somebody doesn't get unauthorized access to vendor master. So what are the type of controls that an organization should consider having in place, or how are those controls implemented? That's really what we're going to talk about in this slide. And I always like to start from the beginning. People often think that the beginning of the process is when somebody starts doing the data entry itself and entering a supplier. And so a lot of times when people think about segregation of duties and fraud risk, they're assuming that the only risk comes from somebody having access to set up a supplier in the system. Or if they're looking at things like enter suppliers and enter purchase orders, or enter suppliers and enter AP invoices as common segregation of duties issues, often they forget that the process of bringing a supplier into an organization to do business with starts outside the system, not in the system. So I call that the supplier onboarding process. And the supplier onboarding process has a process of often has a process of verifying or trying to verify the authenticity of the supplier, and kind of validation and approval process that happens outside the system. And that process itself needs to have its own set of controls and evaluate risks associated with it. And just to give you some context, if you're worried about like a buyer being able to enter a purchase order against a fraudulent supplier, for example, or an AP clerk having the ability to enter an invoice against a fraudulent supplier, if this onboarding process for suppliers has any holes in it, they can effectively establish a supplier without necessarily having the ability to enter the data directly. So what that would look like is, it could be an AP clerk say, hey, I have an invoice for a supplier that I need to process. Can we set this supplier up so I can pay them? So I've got an approved invoice. And the supplier onboarding team may say, oh, well, okay, that makes sense because there's an approved invoice. So it must be that we need to do business with a supplier. So they would say, can you provide contact information for that supplier so I can send them the onboarding documentation. Often there's a form that has certain information being filled out, or it could be they're invited to a web page to be able to enter that data. And then they're required to provide like a W-9 and maybe like a Dun & Bradstreet number or something else. Certainly their banking information would be another thing if they're being paid via ACH. So that initial process of saying, can you set up a new supplier, that has its own fraud risk associated with it. Because if I'm an AP clerk and I'm asking that question to the supplier master team may or may not think about that AP clerk trying to establish a fictitious supplier in the system. And so they may just send that information to the quote unquote supplier, and what they're actually doing is sending that to the AP clerk themselves, or a spouse or a friend of the AP clerk. And the intent is that AP clerk's going to enter an invoice against that supplier after the supplier is quote unquote onboarded. Alternatively, you could have a buyer doing the same scenario where the buyer says, hey, so-and-so in manufacturing says we need to start doing business with a supplier. Can you send them all the paperwork to get started? Same process. They get onboarded, and then the buyer could initiate a PO. And one of the fraud risks is a two-way match PO. So on the AP invoice side and the setting up a purchase orders, there may be workflow approval processes either for all purchase orders and all invoices, or there may be that only workflow approval processes happen in certain circumstances. Or it could be that a buyer has the ability to prove a PO within certain dollar limits that are associated with them, and it's maybe they have a $5,000 limit or a $50,000 limit that they can do kind of below dollar routine POs, and that doesn't require a secondary approval for that PO. Or the AP clerk may have the discretion of putting in, through the form, who the approver is for that PO or for the invoice. And if they decide not to enter an approver, then it would not be subject to the AP approval workflow. Or it could be that either the buyer or the purchase order, or the buyer or the AP clerk has an upload process, like a mass upload process where they're getting data on an ongoing basis. Let's say an AP invoice is getting, or AP clerk's getting some invoice files from a third party that needs to be processed, and that gets quote unquote approved by somebody outside the system, sends them the file and says, can you upload these for payment? And that upload process is not subject to AP invoice approval workflow. So point being, when people look at overall fraud risk for an organization, and even in this context of looking at supplier master maintenance, we're going to talk a lot about the data entry and the validation of that data entry and the controls related to it. There's a whole process prior to this where effectively somebody can bypass the intended controls, and certain people may have the ability to initiate that a supplier be set up. And that initiation process, if it doesn't have the right approval and validation processes, or in some cases, like it's almost impossible in that scenario to have to catch somebody if they're trying to commit fraud in that way. So we talked about the process prior to the system. Now let's talk about what happens kind of practically within the system. So that control number one that organizations should have is a process to onboard new suppliers, 10 verification W-9. And often what we recommend is multiple approvals along the way to validate that there really is a need for not only a new supplier, but that particular supplier. And that really is where the challenge is for most organizations is how would you detect if a buyer or AP clerk or somebody with like purchasing authorization, like a department manager or the CFO, if they were trying to effectively establish that fictitious supplier. So most people think about what happens in the system. The process to validate changes to supplier have to come from an authorized source. So getting, I guess this is still a little bit thinking about outside the system, what happens. And so let me step back. So this is really still outside the system before we get into the controls within the system. But sometimes there are changes to suppliers that happen. You may get a letter, you may get an email, you may get a call, and it appears to be somebody saying that the supplier bank account needs to be changed because they've changed banks. Pretty common fraud scheme these days. That has its own process to verify the authenticity of the request outside the system. So it's usually a separate thread altogether. So common controls, once we get into the system, most common we're seeing in modern ERP systems like ERP Cloud is it's a workflow approval process. So that would mean, a workflow design would have to happen to route new suppliers and changes to existing suppliers to a person or a group of people other than the people doing the data entry on the front end. So you have one group doing data entry, one group doing validation of data entry, and that happens through a workflow process. So what that would mean is somebody's entering it, so they have the ability to insert and edit data on the front end. And then once they submit that information, it goes through a workflow. The second group would be looking at the source documents as well provided by the supplier, as we talked about, like those source documents that come in the very beginning of the process to validate that the data entry was complete and accurate. And then once they confirm that, then they would approve that. And what happens in ERP Cloud is then that vendor becomes what's called spend authorized. And prior to this approval process by team 2, it just kind of sits in limbo. It's technically in some staging tables. It's there, but there is no ability to enter a invoice against that supplier or enter a requisition or a purchase order until the point where they are spend authorized. So that's in modern systems. That's what we're seeing. Like ERP Cloud has that functionality that can be implemented by a system integrator or the IT team. But it isn't always the case. It isn't required. So sometimes organizations will use this third mechanism, which is the independent validation of data entry. So you have a group that has the data entry process, and it isn't necessarily something that's subject to workflow approval. They're just entering the data from the front end, and then you have a second group that is pulling reports to validate the data entry. So they're having we'll talk about it in a minute, they're having a report that gives all updates, inserts, updates, and deletes of data So we call it DML activity, data manipulation language. All DML activity, inserts, updates, and deletes are tracked through a process, usually using triggers that tracks inserts, updates, and deletes. So you can have the full like before and after values when updates are happening, and that's deployed through what are called audit policies in ERP Cloud. So where that control happens, there is no suspension of a supplier. As soon as they do the data entry, that data is valid and accurate, and they are able to, like purchase orders can be entered against them, invoices can be entered against them, and requisitions can. So the workflow process doesn't prevent somebody from enacting against that supplier like it does in the first process we talked about. So what comes into play there then is you have group 1 doing data entry, group 2 doing data validation. The only difference is it's not forced by workflow, it is a manual process. So from a fraud prevention perspective, what's absolutely critical in that scenario is the timeliness of the control. Often in a manual control, if we look at a manual control definition coming in and kind of looking at control design, the timeliness of the control may not be sufficient. It may be a purely detective control. So let's talk about that as a scenario. Somebody enters the data, somebody enters the supplier, and let's say it's a monthly control, and so they may or may not get to that validation of data entry that week. It may have to happen once a month, or maybe happen once a week. But if the control isn't done in a timely manner, it's a detective control, and after the fact, they could detect that somebody has either entered data inaccurately, or they've actually entered different data than what was provided by the supplier in an attempt to commit fraud. So in that case, if the payment process is already run, the payments have been released, the payments have been processed by the bank, that payment will have been sent to the fraudulent account of to have committed fraud, and as a detective control, it would identify that the data entry was either inaccurate or fraudulent. At that point, the only thing an organization can do is try to recover the money back from the bank, which is unlikely. The most likely scenario is they have to make a second payment to the supplier, and the fraudulent payment has to be expensed. The ideal scenario, in lieu of doing this data entry validation after the fact, is to do it prior to the payments being released, and that is what we would call a preventive control, albeit it's a manual preventive control. The prevention is happening at the time, based upon the time of the data validation, and that's just the effectiveness of the control has to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Effectively, you want to have an effective control by having the timing of that control happen prior to the release of the payments. So from the system perspective, we either see two types of controls. We're either seeing a workflow approval process, which is governed by the design of the workflow, or we're seeing a validation of the data entry, where really what we're focusing on there is role design. Is the first group needs to have the ability to enter the data, and no other group should have the ability to enter the data. And the second group who's doing the data validation would normally have either a report that gives them the data or inquiry access to the system, and they wouldn't therefore be able to enter and maintain the vendor master data. So part of the control design we'd be looking for, if you look at both of these elements in the workflow approval process, what we'd want to do is step through the workflow design in a walkthrough environment, actually look at the configurations, and there are cases where the workflow approval process, all the various workflows that you can design within ERP Cloud, they do have the ability to allow self-approval, or it can be hard-coded to do self-approval. So it is essential that all the elements of workflow design are screenshotted and reviewed, and any dependencies found that data, whether it's a lookup or a configuration, just asking those questions like what happens at this point in the process and what are screenshots, to validate that the workflow doesn't allow somebody to self-approve. or that yeah, that's really the biggest risk in there. So that's part of what you do from a control design, is to verify the workflow design effectiveness. And the second aspect here, that where there's independent validation, the data entry, and there's a separation, what you'd want to do from a design perspective is validate that only Group A has access to enter the data and nobody else in the system does, and especially not Group B. So that would be something you'd want to test as what we refer to as a sensitive access test, pulling the privileges associated with the entry and maintenance of data, and verifying that through the front end of the application, nobody can enter or maintain data above and beyond just that first group of people in Group A. Now, having said that, all modern ERP systems have other abilities other than to enter and maintain data, other than through what happens through the user interface or the front end of the application. There are processes to convert data. So a SaaS application has to have the ability to convert data from legacy systems. So vendor master maintenance, your system integrator will walk you through a process of converting the data from your legacy system. Often there is a kind of a rationalization on what data is, how much data is going to be converted. And what that means is there's kind of a rationalization, if you will, of the vendors that are brought over. Maybe not all vendors, but only certain vendors that have been paid in the last, let's 6 months, 12 months, 2 years. And that is what is brought over as part of the implementation of the application. So there is a process then of cleaning up the supplier master data and deciding what to convert as part of the initial go live of the system. So there's that conversion process that's available to convert suppliers, and in ERP Cloud terms, that's done through an FBDI process. So you have FBDI processes to both convert supplier data, so like the header information, the name and address, and you have a FBDI process to convert the bank account. So it's a two-step process that has to happen to be able to onboard suppliers. Both of those privileges, one's called import suppliers, the other one's called import supplier bank accounts, are available to use forever. They're not disabled. They can't be disabled. As a matter of fact, the privileges can't be disabled, and the seated roles that have those privileges can't be disabled. Ongoing basis, you're wondering, do I have only team A, that's doing the data entry, having the ability to enter any sort of supplier data? You have what's user.
Jeff, I think we're having some audio issues.
Yeah, I think we lost you, Jeff.
Interface privileges, but you also have other privileges governing things like FBDI processes. Up imports and other things, imports, web services, and APIs that may have the same update, complete. The design controls that are inherent are out of the box. The controls we looked at, the controls about the configuration. There's a report. So a control is a manual control, and that we could look at either a seated report that may have that data, or as I'm going to go through and talk about the enabling of audit policies. The report is a seated report, but it's dependent upon the enabling of the audit policy, and that audit policy stays enabled through the entire period. So every insert, update, and delete forever is going to be reported on the audit policy reports. So there's the concept in the audit community. If a control is based upon the report, has that report been tested for completeness and accuracy? So the ideal scenario from a controls design perspective is to rely upon audit policies or maybe other reports that, like a seeded report that is assumed to be complete, but is not unless audit policies are enabled. Or it could be that management thinks they can develop a custom report based upon looking at the data in the tables directly. And that would be a problem if it wasn't coming from the tables that supported that report on the audit policy data. So regardless, management should think about documenting in scenario 2, where we have a report that's being pulled by team B, the second team, to be able to review the data for completeness and accuracy, making sure there's no fraudulent, name or address changes or supplier bank account changes. Management would want to go through some scenario testing to make sure that, like if I do a change back, for example, that would show the change 1 and then show the change 2 on the report, show both changes. The reason I mention this is there are some systems like e-business suite. There is a report, a seeded report called a supplier audit report, and that actually is not a complete report as it relates to this control. So in the scenario where there's a change back, it doesn't report that change, both the change and the change back. It's really just a point in time report, so it's really fairly deceiving when it's called a supplier audit report. It only kind of shows the data as of a point in time when the report is run. So in the case where somebody has done a change back between the last time you pull the report and the current time you pull the report, it wouldn't show both the change and the change back. All it's going to show is the change back as of a point in time. So my suggestion is, as you're validating control design here, that you do test whatever report is being relied upon. In this case, it should be the reports coming from the audit policies. You test that for completeness and accuracy. You're focusing on inserts, new data being entered. And in most cases, you can't delete data. So you're talking about an update to the data, which show the before and after values. And I would also suggest doing a change back scenario. So a change, seeing change 1 having a before and after value, and change 2 going back to the original value, showing the before and after value. That scenario needs to be reflected upon the report. The third type of control that I've alluded to is what are called configurable controls. Sorry, I'm going to talk about access controls first. Sorry, access controls. This is scenario 2, where we're separating the entry of a vendor from the approval of the vendor, and that could be done in some systems via 2 separate permissions. That's not the case in ERP Cloud. There is no post supplier changes type permission. Like you may have that scenario where you have like enter journals and post journals. Somebody's entering the data, somebody's posting the data. There is no such, there's no ability to do that within the security design element out of the box. The most common type of control design is a configurable design, and that is where most systems typically fall in, and that's, the workflow approval process is usually where we are doing the configuration. So as I mentioned before, that's really where we're trying to do the walkthrough of the workflow approval process, and making sure that there is no way for somebody that's doing the data entry to approve their data. Sometimes, workflows can be designed in different ways. It could be that, a role code or role name is hard coded into the entry side, or the like, I don't know, like it's hard coded that's not allowed for somebody in the approval side. So workflow design is fairly flexible, and it isn't always the case that somebody that's doing that workflow design understands how to build workflow to always separate the entry and approval. So, and in other scenarios, there may be other configurations that become relevant. So like in purchasing, for example, you might have a reference to a table that stores approval limits for requisitions and purchase orders. It's not normal, I would see that type of other configuration come into the design of the workflow, because there aren't like limits, for example, but it may be an odd scenario where somebody, you know, from a design perspective just comes up with a scenario. Maybe we should base this upon a role or a job or position or some other scenario. And so that's part of the whole walkthrough of the workflow design, is making sure that you understand if there's a dependency in other configurations, like a lookup or a value set or something. So talk through control design considerations. Next, I want to walk through the enabling of audit policies. So audit policies inherently are not enabled, and what an audit policy does is it allows the system to automatically track inserts, updates, and deletes. So by default, that level of detail, the change tracking down to, you know, the field level, each individual field gets tracked. That is not enabled. It has to be enabled as part of the, hopefully prior to the go live of the system, as part of the setup of the initial system. Then and day one, all the audit policies are enabled that are needed. So this is done through what's called manage audit policies, and we're looking at the Oracle Fusion applications, which is where the kind of the functional audit policies are enabled. And the key attributes, there's a couple places where this has to be enabled, but the key attributes you want to monitor would be supplier name, supplier address, supplier bank account, and another one that is often not thought of is the supplier contact information. So one fraud scenario I haven't brought up yet is the callback. So somebody sends a letter in or sends an email looking like it's coming from a supplier, or they may call somebody and say, I'm, you know, Jane Doe from such and so, we've changed our bank account, can you change our bank account information? So there's the control, the second control we talked about, which is to try to verify that any changes are coming from an authorized source. That's most often done through having a key contact as part of the supplier onboarding process, and then calling that person or a group of people to verify that the letter, the email, or whatever information has been sent is coming from an authorized source. So one fraud scenario would be if somebody has the ability to update contacts, they go in, they update the contact information, then they mail that letter in as if it's a legitimate letter. And when they make the call to the person they think is the authorized person, they're actually calling the fraudster. I can tell you that I've seen that scenario happen. One of our customers didn't have that callback control in place, and there was like $150,000 misappropriation of funds to a fraudulent account done through that scenario. So that's another field that should be audited, and those changes to contact information should be confirmed to make sure that they're legitimate. The other thing I'm going to talk about is not just the audit policies related to supplier master, but that audit policies for all the core changes in the way the application works should be enabled as well. So one of the dependencies we're going to talk about in IT general controls is the dependency related to provisioning of roles. So I talked about like FBDI processes, which, you know, would be something that would bypass the workflow approval process if you're using workflow as a primary mechanism controlling that segregation between entry and approval of data. So the FBDI, the import suppliers, import supplier bank accounts, those are going to be in a bunch of seeded roles. And what you should be looking at in terms of access controls in general is what roles should not be, what seeded roles in particular should not be assigned after go live. So like, for example, there's a couple of examples that I can use here. Up until the 22D, which is the release that just came out, and that organizations are starting to flow into the production environment right now. Up until 22D, the employee role and a few other roles in the HCM module had the ability to enter and maintain, to use the FBDI import supplier bank account process to override and set a new supplier bank account. So this has been a gap that has been in Oracle's role design for a long time. When we did analysis a few years ago, we found 38 roles have the ability to import supplier bank accounts, and there are, I think that there was 10 that were fixed by the HCM team. I think there's either 27 or 28 roles that still have the FBDI process for import supplier bank accounts. So our recommendation from a role design perspective is that none of those roles would be used, and to the extent that you need to leverage one of those roles for a day-to-day role, it should be customized and the FBDI privilege pulled out so that nobody has that FBDI privilege on an ongoing basis to be able to bypass the workflow approval process. So what that means is the seated roles that have those abilities should not be assigned to anybody going forward. So your user provisioning process really has to be perfect. And in order to make sure that you use your provisioning process, nobody is bypassing, like assigning a role that shouldn't be assigned. You have to have audit policies enabled, so you have an audit trail for the additions of roles, the assignment of roles to users, and the removal of roles to users. And that is done through what we call core audit policies, specifically the second to the bottom one here, the Oracle Platform Security Services. Often we refer to those as OPSS logs, or Platform Security Services, the logs associated with those. And that tracks the assignment of roles to users and the unassignment of roles to users. So that's why it's not just the audit policies related to supplier master maintenance have to remain in place, but it's also audit policies to govern things like role assignments and other things we'll talk about as we continue on. So those core audit policies also have to remain in effect. An interesting side note here, up until last December, so 21D, if somebody went in and turned on an audit policy, let's say they were turned on and they turned it off and then they turn it back on, that disabling, enabling of audit policies wasn't tracked anywhere. So that was an enhancement request that we logged, I would say two and a half years ago now. That took Oracle, I think it was about 15 months to put that audit logging in place. So when audit policies are turned on and turned off, it automatically tracks those. There's no way to turn on that logging or turn off that logging. It's inherent. So up until 21D, if I just ask the question, how do we know if the audit policies related to supplier master have been enabled for the entire audit period? Or how do we know that those OPSS logs that track the assignment of roles and the unassignment of roles are have been enabled for the entire period? We wouldn't know that because the logging of these configurations on this page and then the page we looked at prior to this, there was no logging of that ability. So fortunately, those logs do exist now and can be relied upon, but most organizations don't have like the assignment of role, the assignment of roles and the provisioning of roles. There's nobody typically looking at those logs on a proactive basis, or even maybe even at all. Maybe those logs are just there to support internal audits and external audits, to pull as population for user provisioning controls. But the point I would make is, if there are roles that shouldn't be assigned, and those roles could subject an organization to fraud risks, like through the assignment of role that gives an import process, an FBDI import process to be used that would bypass workflow approvals, or web services or APIs, or there's the HCM data loader process that does mass updates as well. You'd want to have tracking enabled on those role assignments, and you'd really want to have a proactive analysis, like every week, reviewing those logs and validating that there's been no unauthorized assignment of a role that shouldn't be assigned. So that's an important control as well. So the dependency we've talked about here, enabling audit policies, core audit policies, and I just, like I mentioned, the 21D, there's still a gap over the disabling of workflows via transaction console. There are many workflows that can be turned on and turned off via the transaction console functionality. And if you disabled a workflow, let's say you went in and you could disable the supplier approval process workflow, and then re-enable it after you've committed your fraud. If you're on the, let's say you're on the supplier master team and you had access to transaction console, you turn the supplier approval process off, you turn it back on, it would not be logged if it's done via the transaction console. So that's still I consider it a bug. It's been an enhancement request we had to log. They forced us to log an enhancement request rather than logging this as a bug. I think this has been out for at least 18 months, and Oracle has not shown any signs they're going to fix this issue. So back to control design considerations, I want to throw one more thing out here. A lot of times there are multiple systems that have data entry associated with it. So there could be we have a client right now that is moving from EBS. They've been on EBS for a long time, and they're migrating to ERP Cloud. So they've brought in the procurement process in ERP Cloud, and they have both EBS and ERP Cloud systems running with integrations. And one of the things we identified that was a gap in the design of their controls was that they didn't have controls over vendor master in both systems. And it was possible for somebody to enter, I think they are doing the data entry in ERP Cloud now for suppliers, and but they're interfacing the supplier data still from EBS, I think is what it was. And so effectively what we identified is that the controls still need to be in both systems to make sure that there's no fraudulent data entry in either system. And then I mentioned this as a gap. The employee role had the ability to import supplier bank accounts. I think there's 28 roles that still have that ability that remains. So role design is the primary role design, not as using those roles, and then customizing those roles to remove that ability is critical for organizations. And then not assigning the roles that have that ability, which by default you can't disable a seated role or a custom role that you wouldn't want assigned. It's automatically available in the list of values for people doing user provisioning. And I mentioned what abilities can bypass workflow, override, role design, APIs, web services, import processes, conversions, and mass upload via things like HCM data loader. So in conclusion, to avoid fraud in general, and I think a lot of organizations think about financially significant fraud that could cause, like a significant deficiency or material weakness from an external audit perspective. Role design must be perfect. You must, in the two scenarios, you have two different types of roles that have to be implemented depending upon whether you're using a workflow approval process or you're separating the entry and approval of data outside the system. So we talked about different scenarios there. Supplier master controls must be perfect. User provisioning controls must be perfect. Nobody should be, for example, as I mentioned, nobody should be assigned a role that would allow them to bypass it, or nobody should be given a role that gives them supplier master maintenance that is not authorized. Controls over change control. So the change control process must be perfect. If changes are made to roles, for example, then you've got to make sure that there is not an inadvertent assignment of a supplier master maintenance to somebody. And then what I haven't talked much about yet at this point, but I'll talk about just briefly, is patch impact analysis. There are four quarterly patches coming year, and Oracle could introduce a new role that gives the ability to do supplier master maintenance, or they could make a change to an existing role that adds that ability. And you would need to be validating each quarter that there is no unauthorized access to vendor master maintenance hopefully during that 2-week window that patches are applied and before it's moved into production. You want to have some sort of SOT tool like PathLock to be able to test those access controls before, during, and after the patches. using sensitive access risks and all those objects we talked about, the primary one through the UI, APIs, web services, FBDI, HCM data loader, all those things need to be tested to make sure that nobody's getting unauthorized access coming out of the patch. Another thing I haven't really mentioned, and I'll mention, I think is critically important, is SSO MFA controls must be complete and perfect. There is a real, there's a rise in a real risk of phishing attacks, and there have been, like we know of an end user organization that did not put multi-factor authentication on the supplier portal, and they had a series of suppliers that got their credentials disclosed or hacked, if you will, by phishing attacks. And what the threat actor did at that point, the fraudster went in, logged in as them, and they changed their supplier bank account to a fraudulent account. And it happened 3 times before they realized that they had a gap, that there were, those accounts were being targeted. And we talked to them, and one of the things they're asking about is how do we implement MFA controls for suppliers? And a lot of organizations don't do that just because they don't want to put that burden on supplier, or they don't want to, onboard them through the SSO process, or have non-SSO accounts being governed by multi-factor authentication. So that must be complete and perfect as well. And there are always, or I say like most of the time, if not always, there are cases where there are local accounts. So you have MFA that has to be governed through SSO or identity provider, and Oracle does not have multi-factor authentication enabled as part of the local logins, and that's a pretty significant gap that I don't think they're ever going to really, frankly, solve. So you need to think about monitoring those accounts a lot more closely, the logins and password resets in particular for those accounts, given there is potential for phishing attacks against those. So then finally, logging must be enabled, but we've identified that, like, even transaction console, it's incomplete, and then you really want to have an IT compliance process to make sure that controls are operating effectively and consistently, so there's no gaps. So that's concluding. I can look to see if there's any questions. At this point, no questions have come in. I'll just pause for a second. And if there aren't any questions, I will thank you for your time. I hope this information was valuable. And if you have questions about any material, or you need some help in evaluating your controls, role design, or what have you, you can contact me at my contact information here, Jhare, Jhare at erpra.net. And I appreciate your time. You guys have a great day.
Thank you, Jeff, for your presentation. And again, if you have any questions, please email Jeff at his email provided. And if you would like to join any of the other sessions coming up throughout the day, please click on the link in the chat. And with that, we'll just say thank you, and we hope to see you at future events.